From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Wednesday, April 29th, 2015. On today's show, we'll examine how women's reproductive rights are in jeopardy. First, a look at why maternal mortality rates in the United States are increasing. Monica Simpson of Sistersong will join us. And second, how women in El Salvador are being imprisoned for having miscarriages. Activist Paki Wieland will discuss the global movement in solidarity with the women. And we'll hear part two of a two-part conversation with teacher, activist, and writer Jesse Hagopian about his new book, More Than a Score, The New Uprising Against High-Stakes Testing. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Courtney Morris, Assistant Professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. Hi, Courtney.
Hi, Sonali.
President Obama addressed the unrest in Baltimore, Maryland yesterday during a press conference where he said there was, quote, no excuse for violence and used the loaded terms criminals and thugs. But he wasn't describing the Baltimore police and the death of Freddie Gray, rather the protesters who destroyed property and injured officers. He did speak forcefully to police, saying they have to do some, quote, soul searching. This morning, in an interview with the Steve Harvey Morning Show, Obama reiterated his positions and went on to add, quote, my heart goes out to the police officers who were injured in the past few days. They showed extraordinary restraint. It shows how tough a job like policing can be. Meanwhile, presidential candidate Hillary Clinton is giving a major speech at Columbia University this morning on mass incarceration and police targeting of black communities. Courtney, what do you make of Obama's remarks on Baltimore and on the Clinton speech? Do you think she's being opportunistic for addressing this issue in her bid for the presidency?
Well, President Obama is right. Being a police officer is a difficult job, but so is surviving police abuse. And I think that there were, quite a few things that he did get right in his speech and that are worth taking into consideration and taking seriously. And his major point that what we've been seeing happening in Baltimore over the last few days has really been years in the making, I think is correct. And the way and dealing with the problem of police abuse is really going to require us taking stock of the structural conditions that really produced this uprising. And so, the Baltimore Police Department has a terrible record since 2011. They've paid more than $5.7 million in settlements to more than 100 Baltimore residents for police brutality cases and civil rights violations, and had to spend another $5 million on legal fees litigating those cases. So this is clearly a major problem in Baltimore, and I think it's also much bigger than Baltimore. And we saw Hillary Clinton is definitely capitalizing on that. It's politics, so opportunism is the name of the game. But given her support for tough on crime legislation in the 90s, it's really hard to imagine that she'll be able to deliver the kind of reform we need. But if there's any possibility that she's going to do it, I think it's going to come through the kinds of mobilization and increased public pressure that we've seen emerge over the last year.
Meanwhile, the streets of Baltimore are quiet this morning after a curfew ended at 5 a.m. Last night, when the curfew began, hundreds of residents defied it, protesting and engaging in civil disobedience. Many Baltimore residents volunteered earlier in the day to clean up their city after violent clashes between police and protesters left broken glass and other debris on the streets. And solidarity protests took place in Ferguson, Missouri last night, where the Black Lives Matter movement first gained steam in the wake of Mike Brown's death. There were shots fired and 2 people injured in Ferguson, but it's not clear if those were linked to the protests. There are solidarity protests happening in many cities around the country. Well, Courtney, what do you make of the fact that when the protests are uneventful, they receive no media coverage? If a few windows are broken, the press is all over it.
Well, I think it reveals what many have long suspected, which is that private property matters more than Black lives. I mean, as I watched the reports coming out about Baltimore yesterday, I was really struck by the people calling for peaceful protests who have in the past seemed to have had relatively little to say about this widespread problem of police abuse. And I find myself wondering why it is that we're able to be unequivocally critical of the actions of individual looters, stealing TVs and throwing rocks through storefront windows, and we're not as unequivocal in our condemnation of basically state-sponsored killing of black civilians. And I think that again, it's because in this country we really do not value Black lives as much as we value private property.
And in international news, the Nigerian government has triumphantly announced that it has rescued nearly 300 young girls and women from the Boko Haram militant group. But the girls who were abducted from the village of Chibok last summer, prompting an international campaign, #BringBackOurGirls, were not apparently among those just rescued. The news comes a day after a horrific report emerged of the discovery of hundreds of dead bodies, including those of women and children, in the northeastern town of Damasak, apparently victims of Boko Haram. President-elect Muhammadu Buhari has denounced Boko Haram as a, quote, fraud and as terrorists. He takes power next month and has vowed to toughen the government's position against the extremists. Now, Courtney, the news that has emerged from Nigeria over the past year continues to be just more and more depressing. Are you at all hopeful that this new government may be able to make some headway on the crisis?
Well, I'm always hopeful that, we can turn a situation around, but I'm also a pragmatist. Mr. Buhari came into power through Nigeria's first open and free democratic elections with a lot of popular support, because many Nigerians hoped that as a military man from the north who's enjoyed quite a lot of popularity there, he would be able to neutralize Boko Haram. But, one of the things that I think we have to consider is the fact that the Nigerian military, which has been charged with dealing with this problem, has continued to be plagued with corruption and inefficiency. And so there's a real question as to whether Mr. Buhari will be able to mobilize the military both to push back Boko Haram and to protect citizens who are their targets. And so Boko Haram poses a very formidable threat, and they're armed and they're mobile. So the task ahead will be quite difficult, and it's very likely that we will see more violence in the months to come. Before things will very likely get worse before they get better, if they get better.
Thanks, as always, Courtney, for joining us. We'll talk to you next week.
Bye, Sonali.
Courtney Morris is our daily Newsflash guest expert. She's an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. Here is an unusual and depressing fact. The rate of mothers dying during childbirth in the U.S., that is the maternal mortality rate, has been steadily rising over the years. It is now more than twice the rate than in 1987. The U.S. is only 1 out of 8 countries in the world where this rate is rising, and the only industrialized country in the world to see an increase. One reporter writing in the Washington Post estimated that, quote, a woman giving birth here is twice as likely to die than in Saudi Arabia and 3 times as likely than in the United Kingdom. The grim statistic is not homogeneous. High maternal mortality rates are particularly clustered in the South, in states like Mississippi, and inside those states it is primarily poor women of color who are dying in childbirth. One organization working to address the high rates, Merck for Mothers, has called it a human rights crisis. While the reasons for the increase are complex, partly it has been attributed to the rising cost of medical care and the continued underinsuring of poor women. My guest is Monica Simpson, Executive Director of Sistersong, Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. Welcome to Uprising, Monica. Can you hear me, Monica? We're going to try to get Monica on the line with us. She is Monica Simpson, Executive Director of Sistersong. And in the meantime, just to give a little bit more context and specifics to those numbers, there are 18.5 mothers' deaths per 100,000 births in the U.S. today. In 1987, that number was only 7.2 deaths per 100,000 births. And so the rate today is double what it was in 1987. And much of that increase has been attributed to what is happening in the southern states in the United States, mostly among poor communities of color and poor women in particular. And we are going to try to bring Monica on back with us. Can you hear me now, Monica?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thanks so much for joining us. Now, what is your understanding for why the rate of women dying in childbirth is increasing in the U.S.? I mean, this just is sort of bizarre, and I think it hasn't really been noticed.
It very much is bizarre, and it's something that came to our attention when we worked with the Center for Reproductive Rights last year on creating a report to take to Geneva about this very issue, which is called Reproductive Injustice, looking at racial and gender discrimination in the U.S. healthcare system. And that's exactly what we're finding here in the South, because this study was very much focused on Southern women, and more specifically Black Southern women, where we were seeing that here in the South, Black women were dying at a rate 4 times higher than white women in the South. And so as a Woman of Color Reproductive Justice Collective, we really wanted to get to the bottom of that and really figure out what those issues were. And that's what came up for us in some of the stories that we were able to bring to this report from women in Mississippi and in Georgia, was that their ability to have the access to healthcare that they need, there was a lot of barriers there, and that discrimination in the healthcare system is still a serious issue for women of color in this country. So those were two of the main reasons that a lot of women were seeing a rise in maternal mortality and just an issue with complications in childbirth in general.
What about the issue of health insurance? On Mississippi in particular, some folks are pointing to the fact that the conservative state government there decided not to expand Medicaid to poor people in line with the Affordable Care Act like other states did. Could that explain partly why so many poor women in Mississippi are dying during childbirth?
Absolutely. That's a huge issue in the South in general. The South, when we look at the map of the U.S. and we look at like all of the states that expanded Medicaid, that is an issue for the South. They're not allowing for Medicaid expansion to be in the South, right? And so in Georgia alone, which is where we're based, if our governor was to expand Medicaid, that would allow over 600,000 folks to have access to health care, right? And just think about like what that would look like magnified across the South if Medicaid expansion was something that our Southern, legislators were about. And so because we see Medicaid expansion not being implemented across the South, we're seeing more folks with less access to care, and that's not making it possible for us to have healthy pregnancies or healthy births or healthy families.
And this is a political calculation, is it not? I mean, it doesn't cost the state, I understand, as much to expand Medicaid as it does to cover the emergency health care costs of people who are uninsured.
Absolutely, it's a political issue. It really is. When we get down to the nuts and bolts, it's not an economic issue, because the federal government has definitely worked to try to make it easy for states to expand Medicaid, to expand care, because ultimately we want the Affordable Care Act to be successful. We want everyone getting the maximum amount of care. So when we look at what's happening in the South, this comes down to the regular things that we deal with in the South all the time, and these wedge issues, and it becomes a political stunt for us. And when I feel like whenever we use these types of issues as wedge issues, then we're not helping the most vulnerable. We're not helping the most marginalized. And that's what this is supposed to be about. And we're infringing upon a human right, right?
Right. So on the fact that we're seeing these rising rates of women dying in childbirth, much of that clustered in southern states and within those states among poor communities of color, impacting disproportionately poor women of color. What about the sort of micro issue of what some people have raised, even the interactions between doctors and pregnant mothers of color? Some studies find that doctors, for example, underestimate the pain that women of color say they experience compared to white women. Is this something that you think is also a contributing factor?
Absolutely. That goes back to the piece of the report and a lot of the stories that we were able to lift up around the discrimination factor, right, with women of color in the South. And just to give a very clear example, like one of the women that came to one of our focus groups basically said that, you know, she was a young mother of color. She was already a mother, but she was pregnant again. And as soon as she walked in, she did not get the proper care. The doctor was totally dismissing her. Did not treat her as if, you know, she was a new mother, that this is something that was, you know, was important, right? And he basically just said to her, oh, well, it's okay. I know you'll be back soon anyway, right? And so women of color are just under such scrutiny from the healthcare system, especially in the South, from whether it's shaming them because they're young parents or, you know, just not being given the same amount of attention and information that other women who may have more access to insurance or more access to resources would have. And so we're seeing that a lot of women are dealing with so many more complications, so much more pain, and losing their lives because of this issue of discrimination.
Is the criminalization of abortion in many conservative states also a factor in maternal mortality? I mean, we know that when women are giving birth to their third or fourth child, the risk of dying during childbirth goes up the more children you have. And if their pregnancies might be unwanted, but abortion is not readily available or legal in their states, could that contribute to maternal mortality?
We're definitely finding that there are links to that, right? And you're absolutely right. You know, the more, the older that you get, right? I mean, that is also a factor. Right. And so, yes, that link between, you know, women who may not want to give birth, but are forced because of their lack of access or their locality or whatever to actually get abortion services. We're really still doing work around that, but there definitely could potentially be links there. And so what we advocate for is to make sure that in all states, right, across the country, that abortion services, which to us is a part of healthcare, it's a part of a woman's whole healthcare, right? That they are accessible, that they are affordable, and that they're safe, right? Because we do not want this to be a hindrance for any woman in this country or any individual who's seeking abortion services, and for this to potentially end up being something that leads them to maternal mortality or any other complications.
And we should mention that abortion clinics often offer full-service prenatal and reproductive health care in general, pap smears and other prenatal care, even for women who might be considering getting pregnant.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's something that doesn't get discussed a lot, right? Because there's just so much stigma, right? When we talk about abortion, and that's all they think that abortion care providers provide, and that's not true. Yeah. They provide so much more, and not just, you know, pap smears and things like that, but they do testings and screenings that really help women be able to do a full spectrum of family planning for themselves, whether that's if you want to have children or not. You're looking at your whole body, you're figuring out what's happening, you're understanding what you're dealing with. And so all of that happens within abortion clinics, within providers that also provide abortions, right? Because I think that by just saying abortion providers, we're already knocking out the other services that they provide, and that's not fair, right? So I think that as the more that we start to talk about abortion as a part of overall healthcare, right, then we'll start to, you know, push back some of that stigma that then just, you know, targets these clinics as just being these places that folks go to get abortions.
Finally, on this issue, and I have a few more questions, but staying on the issue of maternal mortality, Monica, how do you sort of summarize what needs to be done to address the rising rates of maternal mortality? It just should be a stain on this country internationally that it's one of 8 countries in the world that this rate is rising, the only industrialized country where the rate is rising, in addition to increasing access to health care, such as expanding Medicaid. Isn't there also a conversation we need to be having around poverty in general?
Absolutely. First of all, I think that what we have to start doing is having the conversation like we're having right now, right? The fact that this is not on the radar of, folks in this country is just, it's horrible. And so that's why, this is so shocking to some folks. It's like, we didn't even know that this was happening, right? So the more that we have opportunities to actually have the discussion, I think that's one way that we are going to start to address the problem. And we have to look at this, just like you said, from the economic standpoint, from the health disparity standpoint, from, discrimination, like all of these things have to be addressed because all of these issues play a role in the issue of maternal mortality, right? If women of color specifically are still at the bottom of the barrel in terms of their economic status and they don't have access to healthcare, they don't have access to resources to be able to, live healthy lives, then we're going to continue to see maternal mortality rising. If we're not talking about health disparities and talking about how that also plays a role in hypertension and in gestational diabetes and all of these other things that women are experiencing in their pregnancies, which then lead to complicated births, then we're going to continue to see maternal mortality rising, right? If we don't talk about the role that our legislators play in this conversation with ensuring that Medicaid expansion is something that happens in the South and all over this country, and that women and everyone has access to the health care that they need to be able to live healthy lives, then we're going to continue to see maternal mortality rising. So all of these issues are directly connected to this issue and to the overall reproductive lives of women in this country.
In our next story, Monica, we're going to cover the criminalization of mothers in El Salvador who are being imprisoned for up to 30 years for having a miscarriage. They're being accused of killing their fetuses. But aren't we also moving towards a similar situation here in the United States with the recent conviction and sentencing of Purvi Patel, a young South Asian woman who had a miscarriage? She is serving a 20-year sentence. Her lawyers just filed an appeal yesterday. And it seems like we're not that far off from what's happening in El Salvador.
It's a rising issue here in the United States, and it's actually really, really sad, right? So this is an issue that Sistersong has really been on the front end of for quite some time. And so we saw this with Marissa Alexander in Florida, right? It was another woman who was basically trying to protect rather her family from an abusive partner, and she was put in jail, right, for 20 years for that. And then we now in Tennessee, there's these criminalization bills for mothers who are dealing with substance abuse, or even if they're thought to be dealing with substance abuse issues. And now we have Purvi Patel. So we see that there is this over-criminalization, this over-policing of women of color, of mothers of color in this country that's becoming a serious issue in the United States, and something that we cannot ignore because it is happening all across the country. And this case with Purvi Patel, it's absolutely heartbreaking because we have a young woman who's dealing with a miscarriage, which is already a traumatic experience, right? And to now have to be criminalized for something that's already traumatic and something that you already have to do healing from is absolutely obscene. And I think it's shame on Indiana, right? Shame on
the state of Indiana,
folks, right? Who are really pushing for these things to happen to mothers who are some of the most vulnerable in our society. It blows my mind.
And finally, there's also the very troubling story from Texas, where the state legislature there is currently considering a bill that would force women to carry their fetuses to term, even in cases where those fetuses might be medically non-viable or showed clear signs of life-threatening abnormalities. I mean, that sounds utterly horrifying to me. And they've done this instead of taking up a bill that would have supported breastfeeding in new mothers. They chose to address that one bill over the breastfeeding support bill.
Yeah. And we've seen this. I mean, I think 2010 was kind of like the year where we saw this onslaught of like all of these, crazy bills being pushed all across the country, trying to, in my opinion, and just really move us away from, just trying to dismantle Roe v. Wade in any way that they most possibly can do. And so they're chipping away at it in all possible scenarios. And this is an issue that we cannot, I mean, the war on mothers, the war on women, like this is serious, right? And so we're seeing this in Texas, we're seeing this all over the country with bills being pushed to limit, access to abortions. And it's frightening, right? Because what scares me about this scenario, right, is that when we think about limiting a woman's ability to have access to an abortion, then that's pushing us back to pre-Roe v. Wade. And what were we looking at pre-Roe v. Wade? Women were losing their lives. Right? Because at the end of the day, if someone does not want to give birth to a child for whatever reason that is, they are going to find a way for that not to be the case. And so we saw folks hurting themselves, their bodies, and killing themselves trying to end a pregnancy, an unwanted pregnancy. So it scares me to think that we have lawmakers in this country who are interested in pushing us back to that time, when instead of moving us to a place where abortions are safe and accessible, right, and that folks are able to live healthy reproductive lives. That's
Right.
a very scary time.
So that women who do want to, of course, have children and give birth also do it in a healthy way and survive the childbirth. Going back to what we were just starting our conversation with. Monica, thank you so much for joining us. Give it a website for Sistersong.
I do. Our website is www.sistersong.net, and we would love to hear from you. Please stay connected to us, and we'll stay connected to you.
Thank you so much. Sistersong.net is a website. Monica Simpson is the executive director of Sistersong, Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. This is Uprising. After this break, we'll turn to what's happening in El Salvador. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. More than 100 women in El Salvador have been imprisoned over the past 10 years for abortion-related crimes. In 17 of those cases, women who have miscarried have also been convicted and sentenced to lengthy terms. The law has been widely condemned internationally. Even the president of El Salvador's own legislative assembly, Sigfrido Reyes, has called it, quote, medieval. In 1998, an incoming conservative government changed El Salvador's abortion law so that exceptions for rape and medical risk were eliminated. Now abortion is completely illegal, and apparently so is miscarriage. To many, that sounds ludicrous, given that miscarriage is as out of one's control as, say, cancer is. There is now a global movement to free the 17 women imprisoned for miscarriage. Last week, a number of activists in the United States participated in a sit-in at the Salvadoran embassy in Washington, D.C. in solidarity with the imprisoned Salvadoran women. 4 of the activists were arrested, among them my guest, Paki Wieland. She's a longtime peace and justice activist and a member of Grandmothers for Peace. Welcome to Uprising, Paki.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Now, thanks for shedding some light on this issue, too.
Are the women imprisoned for having miscarriages being convicted of homicide? Why is this carrying a worse sentence than the abortion-related crimes? And, of course, I personally consider neither of those things crimes.
Right, I agree with you. Yes, it seems that what had happened was a lot of women had been convicted of abortions, but the abortion conviction only has 8 years as a sentence. The aggravated homicide, which many of the women have been convicted of, has a minimum sentence of 30 years. And a number of women that the School of America's delegation met with this past winter have served already 8 years of a 30-year prison sentence.
And so this sounds
So
similar.
in response to hearing about that, a number...
Go ahead, Paki. And so what Paki has been telling us is that these women in El Salvador, specifically 17 of them serving 30-year sentences, have been imprisoned for the aggravated crime of homicide, that is essentially killing their own fetus. And among them are also women who've been imprisoned for the so-called crime of having an abortion. One woman named Carmen Guadalupe Vasquez Aldana, who was serving a 30-year sentence, has been freed after her case was reviewed. She had already served 7 years, and she is the first to be released from prison. But many of the others continue to remain imprisoned. We are attempting to get Paki on the phone with us. We apologize for some of the technical problems we're having today. Paki Wieland is a longtime peace and justice activist, member of Grandmothers for Peace. Hi, Paki. Can you hear me now?
I certainly can.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit of what you were saying regarding the women who continue to remain in prison. And also, by the way, tell us about the protests that you were involved in, the sit-in that you were involved in, that you were arrested for.
Well, we were invited to go to the Salvadoran embassy because I think the only way that the women who are imprisoned right now are going to really get justice is by having the international community speak out for them. In a sense, they are the voiceless. Their situation has really been marginalized, and so when we in other countries around the world are speaking out on their behalf, this helps bring light to it, to the whole issue. And as you said earlier, we're in concert that these laws are so draconian, and the implementation of them is absolutely horrendous.
Tell us about Carmen Guadalupe Vasquez Aldana. She is one of the women who has just been freed after her case was reviewed, and she's already served 7 years. Is she the first to be released, and why was she released?
She was the first to be released in my awareness, and she was released because the prosecution didn't follow proper protocol. It wasn't because there was a new awareness on the part of the government that they were acting extrajudicially. So so she was freed because the prosecutor didn't follow protocol. But her release, I think, has opened the whole conversation again, and that's what's very helpful for all of us.
Right. So also tell us how bad the prison conditions are where these women are imprisoned. And this is probably the case that most prisoners in El Salvador experience pretty squalid conditions, right?
The situation, as I read about it, is that there is 1,000% more. There are 1,000% more prisoners than the prisons are built to hold, and the situation, according to the women who our delegation interviewed, is just horrific. It's squalid, and there are about 100 children living with their mothers in the prisons. Children under age 5. Okay. So we're not simply talking about, although we're talking primarily today about the women who have been incarcerated for having miscarriages, but across the board, there are so many women in El Salvador who are very poor. And I think that needs to be noted too.
How politically powerful is the church in El Salvador, and is that one reason why these laws continue to be implemented and enforced? And I should mention it's not the only country in South America, in Latin America, I should say, that has such anti-abortion and anti-women laws, but it's pretty severely enforced in El Salvador.
Yes, it seems that that's the place where it's most enforced, although there are other countries, including Haiti. But But I think what happens when there are economic crises, and certainly the economic situation in El Salvador is critical, that one of the things that happens is the ultra-conservatives, including the people from the Arena Party and people who support them, particularly those in the very, very conservative element of the Catholic Church. And so those two forces combine, and this is what you have. You have Opus Dei and this very conservative flank of the Catholic Church, and this very conservative political party joining forces to oppress women.
And now, Paki, what has been the movement like internationally in solidarity with these women, and what was the reaction of the embassy staff last week when you had the sit-in? Were they sympathetic to your cause?
Well, I think the true leader of this is Amnesty International, who has really brought this forward in a number of different countries, and the support of the people in the embassy for our stance was very evident. The ambassador wasn't there, and that's why we were sent away. We were arrested because we wouldn't leave, but the ruling party, is much more liberal, but it doesn't have a vast majority. It doesn't have a great majority, but most of the people in Parliament, it seems, would be supporting us, would be supporting the women. One of the problems is that they have been so framed as evil, as criminal, that to take a stand on their behalf is threatening to people in El Salvador, which is why we in the international community have to take the stand, have to speak out, because we are much less at risk than people in El Salvador. And that includes physicians to whom women have come having miscarriages, who are very frightened often and refuse to help them, and have on some occasions even called the police on their in regard to the women.
An unbelievable issue. I mean, for women anywhere who are in our audience who have had a miscarriage, just to imagine, whether in El Salvador or here in the United States, as the state of Indiana showed with Puri Patel, to be criminalized for having a miscarriage is just unimaginable. And as Sigfrido Reyes said, medieval. I want to thank you so much, Paki Wieland, for joining us and helping shed light on this issue.
Well, it's my pleasure. There's a Christina who was 18 years old who collapsed in the home of her family and having a spontaneous abortion, having a miscarriage. And when she woke up, her mother took her to the hospital, and when she woke up, she looked up and found a police officer, not a doctor at her bed.
Terrible stories. I want to thank you so much for joining us. Paki Wieland is my guest, a longtime peace and justice activist, a member of Grandmothers for Peace, one of several people arrested last week at a sit-in at the Salvadoran embassy. Alongside her was also arrested Father Roy Bourgeois. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. On our program yesterday, we spoke with Jesse Hagopian, a teacher and activist who's edited the new book, More Than a Score, The New Uprising Against High-Stakes Testing. 2 years ago, Hagopian and other teachers at Garfield High School in Seattle, tired of seeing their students have precious teaching time stolen from them because of the hours of required standardized testing, decided they would revolt, and they began refusing to administer the Measures of Academic Progress, or MAP test. The revolt spread to a number of other schools, and eventually the teachers were told the test would not be a requirement of graduation. Thus began a new stage of organizing among teachers and students against a regime of high-stakes testing. Jesse Hagopian teaches history and is a Black Student Union advisor at Garfield High School, associate editor of Rethinking Schools, and a founding member of Social Equality Educators, winner of the 2013 Secondary School Teacher of the Year Award from the Academy of Education, Arts and Sciences. He writes for a number of publications, including Truth Out and the Black Agenda Report. Here is part 2 of our conversation.
You only have to look at New Orleans to find out what the testocracy's vision for the future of education is. Because in New Orleans, in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, Arne Duncan said that Hurricane Katrina was the best thing that ever happened to the New Orleans public schools. And that horrific statement reveals his agenda, because what he meant by that was that because the public schools were shut down by the storm, they were able to then come in and exploit that crisis to now having shut down all the public schools in New Orleans, and now that is 100% charterized school district, privatized school system, which receives public taxpayer funds, but is not under the democratic control of an elected school board. And I think that that is really the dark vision that the testocracy has for our school system, and why it's so important that so many families are rising up to say one of the last major free public institutions that's offered in this nation has to be supported with all kinds of resources rather than labeled and shut down. And I think that in the world's richest country, in the richest country that's ever existed in the history of the planet, there is enough money to support our students, to lower the class sizes so that teachers can give the individual attention the students need. There is enough money to provide wraparound services so that our children are receiving the tutoring support, the after-school programs, the summer school programs that they would need to be successful. But rather than spend the money and give the resources to the schools that they need, the testocracy is content with endlessly ranking and sorting our children into different stratas of the economy using these high-stakes standardized tests.
Oh, Jesse Hagopian, there is an ongoing scandal in Atlanta, Georgia, where 3 teachers were convicted of a conspiracy to inflate test scores. They've been sentenced to 7 years in prison each. But if student scores are determining their salaries and their school's funding, it's no wonder that they might have gotten desperate enough to lead them to do what they did. What's your opinion on this story and how it fits within this education so-called reform regimen?
Well, the outcome and the situation of the Atlanta cheating scandal is really shameful. And I think it's most shameful of a justice system that would send away educators for many years rather than look at the true criminals in the system. I would say people who willfully neglect the schools by underfunding them. But then how about the bankers who sabotaged the global economy with the Great Recession in 2008? To see those teachers being led away in handcuffs, but not a single banker, trading in credit default swaps that brought down our economy and across the world, I think speaks volumes to the inequality and injustice that exists in our society. And I think we need education to be reorganized to solve these types of problems. Of course, nobody supports, these teachers and administrators' decision to change test scores. But when you have a system that is built around that single number, right? When those test scores can shut your school down or lead to kids not graduating, when there's such high stakes on that, it breeds that type of cheating scandals. And I think we need to completely change what we think is important in the public school, not just bubbling in A, B, C, or D, but using education in service of empowering our students.
And Jesse, you have a chapter in your book written by a teacher named Mallory Clark called Dear Brandon, and I just thought this was such a heartfelt letter from a teacher to a student who she feels she let down because she let him take the MAP test, and feels that she could have instead spent that time teaching him how to read better before he went to college. Can you tell us a little bit about what teachers go through on a personal level when the profession that they've chosen is being so warped and perverted by these tests?
Yeah, well, Mallory Clark is a dear colleague of mine, and she was actually the first teacher that launched the MAP test boycott. And I also found that letter very moving because she apologized in this open letter to her student for administering the MAP test to him in the past, because she knew she didn't need that test to know his reading level, right? Mallory has told me, if I want to know how a kid can do in reading, I use a revolutionary technology. It's called the book, and I take it out and I have him read out loud. And when he stumbles on words, then we can go down a level in the book. And so teachers have all sorts of really useful forms of assessment that we use in our classroom every day to understand the thought process of our student, and to understand how to scaffold their understanding to the next level. And to see education policy be directed at taking away the talents and skills and professionalism that educators have, and replacing that with these technocratic solutions, with high-stakes tests designed by multi-billion-dollar corporations like Pearson that made some $9 billion in profit off of these tests, it is really tragic. And I think it's time to make a complete change and re-empower our educators to be setting education policy, rather than the testocracy, who by and large have not attended public schools.
Right.
And
their kids don't attend public schools.
Right, and their kids don't. And I would just say this, that, Bill Gates attended Lakeside, a private elite high school, and his kids currently attend Lakeside. At Lakeside, they don't do any of the Common Core testing, and they don't have the Common Core. They don't do the MAP test, and they don't inundate their school with high-stakes standardized testing, because at that school they know what matters most is nurturing the whole student, having low class sizes, enriching arts programs, and developing critical thinking. And what I say is that what's good enough for Bill Gates' kids is good enough for ours.
And I want to also sort of spend a little time on the nature of the tests themselves. Earlier, you were talking about how they're, essentially all of them are these bubble tests. And we have a situation where these kids are constantly taking these tests and are being sent the message that the answers to the great questions can be chosen from a set of predetermined options. And that in itself can be very antithetical to the idea of critical thinking. Also, we have children taking these tests on computer screens. There's been this move to bring electronic equipment into schools in Los Angeles, where this program is produced. Huge reliance on iPads, and you probably read about this. LAUSD now wants a refund for all the thousands of iPads that they bought because they didn't meet the standards and they didn't live up to the promise of big technology. Can you comment on some of these issues?
Yeah, convincing students that wisdom is the ability to eliminate a wrong answer choice is really detrimental to the thought process. And I think, though, it fits the needs of the testocracy, because in their mind, they like to set all the possible options we have in our society and then ask us to choose from the different choices, right? They like to ask questions like, what war should the next war be that we engage in? And sometimes the right answer is not the one presented to us. Sometimes the right answer is thinking outside of the box and trying to find other solutions to the problem. But if they can convince us that A, B, C, or D, it's got to be one of those, then they can control what is acceptable knowledge. And I think that we need to completely redefine what knowledge is, what wisdom is, in terms of collaborating towards solutions. And, you know, they have inundated our classrooms so much with education, with these tests, that I think we could even say that we are now moving away from an education and just towards a testucation. And I think that students are no longer reading whole books because they only need to be able to reading passages out of books and identify factual questions out of them. And everything has become in service of test prep. And I think that's deeply harmful. And the move to putting these tests on the computers is called, 21st century assessment, when in reality, most of the Common Core testing is still the same old ABCD bubble test. Now you click the bubble rather than filling it in with a number 2 pencil. But in fact, that move to the computer then enriches the software companies, but does little to promote critical thinking.
Right. You have another very moving part of the book that you edited, More Than a Score, that includes poems by students. So we talked about how teachers have been revolting and being moved to, by what they're being forced to do. But how have students responded? Tell us about this chapter in your book.
Well, students have been some of the most inspiration in this movement. It was only a couple weeks after we announced the MAP test boycott that students in Portland staged a mass walkout against their state test. And then it spread to Chicago, where they had a huge walkout there. And one of the leaders of that walkout, Malcolm London, contributed 2 beautiful poems to the book. And I'm happy to say that I'm going to be joining him this weekend to go speak in a forum called Hands Up, Don't Test, the struggle for Black education. And this, I think, really gets to the fact that many students of color are beginning to understand the way these tests are being used to perpetuate institutional racism, and the way they've always been used to rank and sort rather than empower students of color. And you only have to look at a study out of Boston University that recently came out that shows that the number 1 outcome of attaching high stakes to graduation and having exit exams has been the increased incarceration rates. And, there's currently more Black people behind bars on probation or parole than were slaves on plantations in 1850. And so we know that these high stakes exams are being used to fuel a school to prison pipeline. And I think that's why an increasing number of Black youth and students of color are rising up around this country and saying that part of the Black Lives Matter movement is a demand for ethnic studies and enriched curriculum and nurturing the whole child and seeing many forms of intelligence, not just the ability to eliminate wrong answer choices on a standardized test.
And Jesse, I'm so glad you brought up this issue because, of course, the education reform movement is targeting a system that serves primarily people of color. In certain parts of the country, in certain cities, the majority of kids in school districts are children of color, and it's also a very segregated school system, so certainly this becomes a racial justice issue. I understand that there's a Senate bill that was introduced this month that would revise the No Child Left Behind law and remove many of the provisions on funding and teacher pay and tenure, but it would still require the student testing, particularly from grades 3 through 9, and also that those scores be made public. Is there at least piecemeal, bit by bit, change on the political front in response to the teacher and student revolts against testing?
Well, there's certainly been a rhetorical retreat by some of the leading testocrats. You know, they understand that this is a mass uprising, and the same old tired rhetoric of we need these tests for accountability as they systematically underfund the schools is not convincing parents, students, and teachers around the country. And so even Arne Duncan said the tests are sucking the oxygen out of the classroom, all right? But at the same time, he's actually moving to implement the new Common Core tests on an unprecedented scale across the country. And there's been, you know, some discussion at the federal level of bringing any consequences for these test scores to the state level and having the states decide appropriate measures. And so you can see a bit of a backpedaling from the strict test and punish model. However, there hasn't been a thorough recognition and acknowledgement of how detrimental these exams are, or any serious plan for thinking outside the bubble test. And I think that education policy advocates and politicians would do well to look at the New York Consortium schools. This is an amazing network of public schools, not charter schools, public schools in New York City. And this network of schools has a waiver and don't have to give the state tests. And so by the testocracy's summation, they would venture to guess that these schools would be the very worst in New York City because they don't have those accountability measures. However, these schools have the highest graduation rates in New York City. They have the most kids attending college and staying in college, and they actually have more special needs students than the general population in the New York City public schools. And that's because they use a performance-based assessment model, which is far superior to the standardized testing. If you fill in bubble B, I don't know if that student knew the answer or if they guessed it. I don't know if they were about to circle the wrong answer, but then circled the right answer, right? It actually hides more than it reveals about the thought process. But performance-based assessment is much like when you get a PhD. You develop a thesis, you do research and find evidence. If the evidence doesn't match your thesis, you have to revise your thesis. You can collaborate with your peers and your teacher, and then you present your thesis and your research to a panel of experts, and they actually bring in community members in the field to be on a panel to help assess the students. So if you're in a language arts class, they might bring in a New York City author or journalist to help provide feedback on your research. And students find that this form of assessment means that instead of the test being time away from learning, time away from the classroom, it's actually can be moments of great breakthroughs where you get feedback from leaders in the field. And I think that's a form of assessment that promotes critical thinking, and that's why students are actually doing better in college that graduate from these consortium schools, because at the college level, they don't want to know, can you eliminate wrong answer choices? They want to know, can you think? Right. And that's where I think assessment needs to move in this country.
Well, thank you for sharing that model for our audience. Finally, Jesse Hagopian, for the parents and the teachers and the students who might be watching or listening to this interview and to be part of the public education system and may not have taken the step to opt out or be involved in any way, what message can you give, and particularly if they are disillusioned by the amount of test taking, which most people who are involved directly in it are?
Well, now's the time to act. I mean, for parents, now's the time to act on behalf of your own child and not allow the school system to reduce their intellect to a single number, but to understand the many ways that your student is intelligent and the many different forms of knowledge that need to be honored, and to opt your kid out for that reason, but not just to defend your own child, but to join a growing civil rights movement that's sweeping across this country to say that we need to dismantle the testocracy and these testing regimes because it's part of maintaining institutional racism and class inequality in this country. And we have to build a mass civil rights movement to redefine what's important in education and to bring the resources that our students deserve. And if parents join in with teachers and students in this struggle, I think we'll find that there's no force more powerful.
Jesse Hagopian is the editor of the book More Than a Score, The New Uprising Against High-Stakes Testing, joining us for part 2 of a 2-part conversation. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Joseph Stone is our technical director. Federico Garcia is our audio engineer. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. See you next time.